The African Child, Chapter 8. Later on, I went through an ordeal much more frightening than condemned era. This time, a really dangerous ordeal whose nature is far removed from that of any game: circumcision. I was then in my final scholarship year. I, too, was at last among the big boys whom we had so detested when we were in the infants class because they used to extort food and money from us and used to beat us. Here we were taking their place, and the hardships we had endured at their hands were now happily abolished. But it was not enough simply to be in the big boys' class. We had to be big in every sense of the word, and that meant we had to become men. But I was still a child. I was considered not to have reached the age of discretion yet. Among my companions, most of whom were circumcised, I was still looked upon as a child. I suppose I was a little younger than they, or was it that my repeated visits to Tindikan had delayed my initiation? I do not remember. Whatever the reason, I had now reached the age at which I too must be reborn, at which I too must abandon my childhood and my innocence and become a man. It was not without misgivings that I approached this transition from childhood to manhood. The thought of it really caused me great distress, as it did those who were to share the ordeal. Of course, the ceremony itself, the visible part of it at least, was familiar to us, for each year we would watch the candidates for circumcision dancing in the town's main square. But the essential part of the ceremony remained a secret, and we only had a very vague notion of how it was carried out, though we knew that the operation itself was a painful one. The public ceremony differs completely from the secret one. The public ceremony is one of rejoicing. It is the occasion of a great festival, a very noisy festival in which the whole town participates and which lasts several days. And it is almost as if by dint of noise and activity and dancing and merrymaking, people were trying to make us forget our anxiety about the coming ordeal and its very real physical pain. But however great the anxiety, however certain the pain, no one would have dreamed of running away from the ordeal. No more than one would have dreamed of running away from the ordeal of the lions. And I, for my own part, never entertained such thoughts. I wanted to be born again. I knew perfectly well that I was going to be hurt, but I wanted to be a man, and it seemed to me that nothing could be too painful if, by enduring it, I was going to come to man's estate. My companions felt the same. Like myself, they were prepared to pay for it with their blood. Our elders before us had paid for it thus. Those who were born after us would pay for it in their turn. Why should we be spared? Life itself would spring from the shedding of our blood. That year, I danced for a whole week in the main square at Kurosa, the dance of the Soli, which is the dance of those who are to be circumcised. Every afternoon, my companions and I would go to the dancing place, wearing a cap and a bubu which reached to our heels, a much longer bubu than is generally worn, and split up the sides. The cap, a skull cap, was decorated with a pompon that hung down at the back, and this was our first man's hat. The women and girls would come running to the gates of their compounds to watch us go by. Then they would follow closely on our heels, decked in their holiday finery. The tom-tom would throb, and we would dance in the square until we were ready to drop. And as the week wore on, the dances grew longer, and the crowds grew bigger. My boo-boo, like that of my companions, was of a brownish red color, a color on which bloodstains would not show too clearly. It had been specially woven for the ceremony and had first of all been white. The masters of the ceremonies had then dyed it with dyes made from the bark of trees, after which they had plunged it into the muddy water of a brushwood pool. The boo-boo, in order to obtain the desired tone, had been left to soak for several weeks, perhaps because of some ritual reason which I forget. The cap, apart from the pompon, which remained white, had been treated in the same fashion. We would dance, as I was saying, until we were out of breath. But we were not the only ones dancing. The whole town would dance with us. In our country, all dances have this cumulative tendency because each beat of the tom-tom has an almost irresistible appeal. Soon, those who were just spectators would be dancing too. They would crowd into the open space, and though they did not mix with our group, they would take an intimate part in our revels, outdoing us in frenzy, men as well as women, women as well as girls, though the women and girls kept strictly apart from us in their dancing. While I was dancing, my boo-boo, split from top to bottom at each side, would reveal the brightly colored silk handkerchief which I had knotted round my loins. I was quite aware of this and did nothing to prevent it. In fact, I did all I could to show it off. This was because we each wore a similar handkerchief, more or less colorful, more or less ornate, which we had received from our acknowledged sweetheart. She would make us a present of it for the ceremony, and it was generally taken from her own head. As the handkerchief cannot pass unnoticed, as it is the one personal note that distinguishes the common uniform, and as its design, like its color, makes it easily identified, there is in the wearing of it a kind of public manifestation of a relationship, a purely childlike relationship. It goes without saying, which the present ceremony may break forever, or, as the case may be, transform into something less innocent and more lasting. Now, if our so-called sweetheart was in the least pretty and consequently desirable, we would swing our hips with great abandon, the better to make our pom-pom fly from side to side, and thus show off our handkerchief to greater advantage. At the same time, we would keep our ears open to catch anything that might be said about us, about our sweetheart, and about our good fortune. But our ears caught very little, for the music was deafening, and there was extraordinary animation in the tightly packed crowds all around the square. From time to time, a man would break through the crowd and come towards us. It would generally be an older man, often a person of some consequence who was on friendly terms with or had obligations towards one of our families. The man would indicate that he wished to speak. The tom-toms would stop, and the dancing would be interrupted for a moment. We would gather round him. Thereupon, the man would address himself to one or the other of us in a very loud voice. "O thou," he would say, "hearken unto me. Thy family has always been beloved of my family. Thy grandfather is the friend of my father. Thy father is my friend, and thou art the friend of my son. I come here this day that I may testify these things in public. Let every man here know that we are friends, and that we shall ever remain so. And as a symbol of this lasting friendship, and in order to show my gratitude for the goodwill that thy father and thy grandfather have always shown to me and mine, I make thee this gift of an ox on the occasion of thy circumcision." We would all applaud him. The entire assembly would applaud him. Many of the older men, all of them friends indeed, would come forward like this and make an announcement of what gifts they were going to present us with. Each one would make an offering in accordance with his means, and the spirit of rivalry would often make it beyond his means. If it was not an ox, it would be a sack of rice, or millet, or maize. For the great feast of the circumcision is the occasion of a great banquet attended by numerous guests, a banquet so enormous that despite the number of guests, there is enough for days and days before the end is reached. Obviously, this entails great expense. So whoever is a friend of the family of the boy to be circumcised, or is bound to the family by bonds of obligation, makes it a point of honor to contribute to the banquet, and he will help both those who are in need of help and those who are not. That is why at each circumcision, there is this sudden abundance of gifts and good things. Did we enjoy this sudden shower of gifts? Not unreservedly. The ordeal that awaited us was not of the kind that whets the appetite. No, we would not be likely to have much appetite. When the circumcision over, we were invited to take part in the banquet. Though we did not know it by actual experience, we were quite well aware that freshly circumcised boys have a rather woe-begone look. This reflection would brutally recall our fears. We would be applauding the donor, and at the same time, our thoughts would be returning to the ordeal before us. As I have said, this apprehension in the midst of the general excitement, an excitement in which we, through our dancing, took a major part, was not the least paradoxical aspect of those days. Were we not dancing to forget what we were all dreading? I can quite believe it. And in truth, there were moments when we succeeded in forgetting it, but anxiety was never far away. There were always fresh occasions for it to spring to life again. Our mothers might make increased sacrifices on our behalf, and certainly they did not fail to do so, yet they were but sorry comfort. Sometimes one of our mothers or some other close relative would join the dance, and often in dancing, she would wave aloft the symbol of our class. It was generally a hoe. The peasant class in Guinea is by far the most numerous, and this was to show that the boy who was about to be circumcised was a good laborer. This was when I saw my father's second wife made her appearance, holding aloft an exercise book and a fountain pen. I must confess that this gave me no pleasure at all, and rather than encouraging me, it somewhat embarrassed me, although I knew quite well that my second mother was merely observing an old custom, and doing so with the best will in the world, since the exercise book and the fountain pen were the symbols of a profession which in her eyes was superior to that of a farmer or a mechanic. My real mother was infinitely more discreet. She simply watched me from a distance. I even noticed that she tried to hide in the crowd. I am sure she was at least as anxious as I was, though she took the greatest trouble to conceal the fact. But for the most part, the excitement was such, so all-pervasive, that we had to bear the burden of our uneasiness on our own. Need I mention that we ate rapidly and without relish? It goes without saying, everything centered on the dancing and on the preparations for the feast. We would go home, footsore and weary, and sleep like logs. In the morning, we would never get up, but lay in bed until the very last moment when the tom-tom began to summon us. What did it matter if we had no proper meals? We barely had time to eat. We had to wash at top speed, fling on our boo-boos, jam our caps on our heads, run to the main square and dance. And each day we had to dance more. For we were all dancing now. The whole town was dancing, afternoon and evening, by torchlight in the evening. And on the eve of the ordeal, the town danced all day long and all night long. On this final day, we were all worked up into a strange kind of excitement. The men who performed this initiation, after having shaved our heads, gathered us together in a hut built apart from the compound. This hut, which was very spacious, would henceforward be our dwelling place. The spacious square in which it stood was fenced off by such tight-woven osiers that no inquisitive eyes could see through them. When we entered the hut, we saw our boo-boos and caps spread on the ground. During the night, our boo-boos had been stitched up the sides, except for the armholes, so that they covered us completely. As for the caps, they had been transformed into tremendously high bonnets. The material which had originally hung loose had been stiffened by fixing it to a wicker framework. We slipped into our boo-boos, which made us look rather as if we were in tight sheaths. And now we looked even skinnier than we really were. Then, when we had put our long, narrow bonnets on, we looked at each other for a moment. In any other circumstances, we would have certainly burst out laughing. We looked as long and as thin as bamboo poles. Go and walk outside for a while, the men told us. You must get used to having your boo-boos sewn up. We took a little walk, but we could not take large strides, for the stitched-up boo-boos prevented it. It was as if we were in shackles. We came back to the hut, sat down on the mats, and remained there under the supervision of the men. We chattered among ourselves of one thing and another, concealing our uneasiness as best we could. But how could we banish from our minds the thought of tomorrow's ceremony? The uneasiness underlying all our chatter was obvious. The men who were with us were not unaware of this state of mind. Whenever, in spite of ourselves, we gave vent to our anxiety, they would be at great pains to reassure us. And in this respect, they were quite different from the big boys who performed the ceremony of the lions and who had only wanted to frighten us as much as possible. "Come, don't be afraid," they said. "This has happened to every man. Has it done any harm to them? It won't do you any harm either. Now that you're going to become men, conduct yourselves like men. Drive away your fears. A man is afraid of nothing." But we were still children, all the same, all through that final day and all through the final night. We will still be children. As I have said before, we were not even considered to have reached the age of discretion. And if that age is a long time in coming, if it does really come only after many years, our manhood will seem all the more premature. We were still children. Tomorrow. But it was better to think of something else. To think, for example, of the whole town gathered in the main square and dancing happily. But what about us? Were not we too about to join the dance? No. This time we were going to dance on our own. We were going to dance, and the others were going to watch. At present, we were not allowed to mix with other people. Our mothers could not even speak to us, let alone touch us. We left the hut, swathed in our long sheets, and with our enormous bonnets towering on our heads. As soon as we appeared in the main square, the men ran to meet us. We advanced in single file between two rows of men. Kuyate's father, a venerable old man with white beard and white hair, thrust through the ranks and placed himself at our head. It was his privilege to show us how to dance the koba, a dance kept like the soli for those who are about to be circumcised, and which is danced only on the eve of circumcision. Kuyate's father, by virtue of his great age and good name, was the only one who had the right to strike up the chant which accompanies the koba. I was walking behind him. He told me to put my hands on his shoulders, and then each of us placed his hands on the shoulders of the boy in front of him. When our Indian file had been linked up in this way, the tom-toms and drums suddenly ceased, and everyone was silent. Everything became silent and still. Kuyate's father then drew himself up to his full height, cast his eyes all round him. There was something imperious and noble in his attitude, and as if it were a command, lifted up his voice in the koba chant. "Koba, aye, koba, lama." At once the tom-toms and the drums shattered the silence, and we all took up the phrase, "Koba, aye, koba, lama." We were walking like Kuyate's father, legs apart, as far apart as our bubus would allow, and naturally with very slow steps. As we chanted the words, we would turn our heads, as Kuyate's father did, to the left, and then to the right, and our high bonnets extended this head movement in a curious way. Koba aye koba lama. We had begun to dance round the square. The older men drew up in 2 rows as we advanced, and when the last of us had passed through their ranks, they went and formed their 2 rows again a little farther on from us to pass through. And because we were walking slowly with our legs wide apart, we looked rather like dogs waggling along. The 2 ranks of men through which we were moving were thick and tightly packed. The women behind would scarcely see more than our high bonnets, and the children obviously even less than that. In previous years, I had only caught glimpses of the tops of the bonnets, but it was enough. The koba is a man's affair. The women, no, the children had no voice in this matter. Koba aye koba lama. Finally, we reached the spot where we had begun our dance. Then Koyate's father stopped. The tom-toms and drums fell silent, and we went back to our hut again. We had barely left the square before the dancing and the shouting began again. 3 times that day we appeared in the main square to dance the koba, and 3 times again during the night by torchlight, and each time the men enclosed us in a living hedge. We did not get any sleep. No one went to bed. The whole town stayed awake and danced all through the night, and we left our hut for the 6th time. Dawn was breaking. Koba aye koba lama. Our bonnets still moved in time to the rhythm. Our bubus were still stretched over our straddling legs, but we were beginning to flag. Our eyes were burning feverishly, and our anxiety was mounting. If we had not been urged on, carried away by the tom-tom beat, but it urged us on, carried us away, and we danced on obediently, our heads curiously light from lack of sleep, curiously heavy too, with thoughts of the fate that was to be ours. Koba aye koba lama. As we came to the end of the dance, dawn began to lighten the main square. This time, we did not go back to our hut. We went immediately into the bush. We went a long way to where there was no risk of our being disturbed. In the main square, the dancing had stopped. The people had all gone home. Nevertheless, a few men followed us out. The rest awaited in their huts the ceremonial shots that would announce to all that one more man, one more Malinke had been born. We had reached a circular clearing, the ground completely bare. All round, grasses grew high, higher than the men's heads. It was the most secluded spot one could have wished to find. We were lined up, each of us in front of a stone. At the other end of the clearing, the men stood facing us, and we took off our clothes. I was afraid, terribly afraid, and I needed all my willpower not to show it. All those men standing in front of us and watching us must see nothing of my fear. My companions showed themselves no less brave, and it was absolutely necessary that it should be so. Among those men standing in front of us was perhaps our future father-in-law or a future relative. We dared not let ourselves down now. Suddenly, the operator appeared. We had caught a glimpse of him the night before, when he had performed his dance in the main square. And now, also, I only caught a brief glimpse of him. I had hardly realized he was there before I saw him standing in front of me. Was I afraid? Was I even more afraid? Had I, at that particular moment, a fresh access of fear? For I had been beset by fears ever since I had entered the clearing. I did not have time to be afraid. I felt something, like a burn, and I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I do not think I cried out. No, I cannot have cried out. I certainly did not have time to do that either. When I opened my eyes, the operator was bent over my neighbor. In a few seconds, the dozen or so boys that were that year became men. The operator made me pass from one state to the other with an indescribable rapidity. Later, I learned that he was of the Dama family, my mother's family. He had a great reputation, and rightly so, for at the most important festivals, he had often circumcised several hundreds of boys in less than an hour. This rapidity was very much appreciated, for it did not prolong the agony. So all the parents who could, had recourse to him, as he was the most skillful. He would be their guest for the evening, and the guest of the town's most important men, then would go back to the country where he lived. As soon as the operation was over, the guns fired. Our mothers, our relatives in the compounds heard the reports, and while we were being made to sit on the stone in front of us, messengers rushed away, tore through the bush to announce the happy news, arriving bathed in sweat and gasping for breath, so much so that they could hardly deliver their message to the family that came running to meet them. Truly, your son has been very brave, they would shout at last to the mother of the circumcised boy. And indeed, we had all been very brave. We had all very carefully concealed our fear. But we were now perhaps not quite so brave, for the hemorrhage that follows the operation is abundant, very long and disturbing. All that blood lost. I watched my blood flowing away and my heart contracted. I thought, is my body going to be entirely emptied of blood? And I raised imploring eyes to our healer, the Sema. The blood must flow, said the Sema. If it did not flow, he did not finish the sentence. He was looking at the wound. When he saw that the blood was finally beginning to flow a little less freely, he put on the first bandage. Then he went on to the others. When the blood had finally ceased flowing, we were dressed in our long bubu again. Apart from a very brief undershirt, this was to be our only article of attire during the weeks of convalescence that were to come. We stood up awkwardly, light-headed, and sick at our stomachs. Among the men who had been present at the operation, I saw several who, taking pity on our plight, turned their heads away to hide their tears. In the town, our parents were making a fuss of the messenger and loading him with gifts, and the celebrations began again. Was it not an occasion for rejoicing over the fortunate outcome of our ordeal, for rejoicing over our new birth? Already friends and neighbors were crowding inside the compounds where the newly circumcised had their homes and were beginning to dance the fadi in our honor, the dance of manhood, until the enormous banquet was ready, which would be shared by all. We too were naturally to receive a large share of the dishes. The young men who had conducted the ceremony and who were also our attendants, as well as our supervisors, went to seek our share. Alas, we had sinned and lost too much blood. Its unsavory smell still seemed to linger in our nostrils, and we all had a touch of fever. We were shaking. We could cast only sour looks on the succulent dishes. They did not tempt us at all, but filled us with revulsion. Of all that extraordinary abundance of viands assembled for our enjoyment, we pecked with a ridiculously feeble appetite at only one or two dishes. We sat looking at them, sniffing at their savory smells. We would take a mouthful, then turn our heads away. At nightfall, we took the road back to the town, escorted by the young men and by our healer. We walked with great care. We could not let the boo-boo rub against the wound, but sometimes, in spite of our precautions, it would do so, making us cry out with pain. We would stop for a moment, our faces drawn with suffering. The young men would hold us up. It took us a very long time to get back to our hut. When we finally reached it, we were at the end of our tether. We lay down at once on the mats. We waited for sleep, but it was long in coming, as our fever kept us awake. Our eyes wandered sadly over the walls of the hut. At the thought that we were to live here until our period of convalescence was over, several weeks, in the company of these young men and our healer, we were seized by a kind of despair. Men. Yes, we were men at last. But what a price to pay. At last we fell asleep. By the next morning, our fever had abated, and we were able to laugh at the somber thoughts of the night before. Certainly, the life we led in the hut was not the same as the life we led in the compounds, but it was not insupportable, and it had its own delights, even though there was constant supervision and the discipline was rather strict, albeit wise and reasonable, with the sole aim of shielding us from anything that might retard our convalescence. If we were watched closely day and night, and even more closely at night than during the day, it was because we were allowed to lie neither on our side nor on our face, as long as our wound was not properly healed. We could lie only on our backs, and of course, we were absolutely forbidden to cross our legs. It goes without saying that when we were asleep, it was difficult to remain constantly in one position. But if we so much as stirred, the young men would intervene at once. They would rectify our position as gently as they could, so as not to disturb our rest. They watched over us in relays so that we never for 1 second escaped their vigilant eyes. But perhaps it would be better if I talked about their attendance rather than their supervision. They were more like nurses than supervisors. By day, when weary of continually sitting or lying on our mats, we asked to be allowed to get up. They would help us. Indeed, at every step we took, they would be at our sides, supporting us. They would go and collect our food, take news of our progress to our parents, and bring us news of them. Their task was no sinecure. We took their good nature for granted, and at times took advantage of it, but they never grumbled. They looked after us with boundless goodwill. Our healer was not so indulgent. He doubtlessly gave us the utmost devotion in his attendance upon us, but he was something of a disciplinarian, though not a harsh one. But he did not like us to pull a face when he was cleaning our wound. "You're not little boys now," he would tell us. "Control yourselves." And we just had to control ourselves if we did not want to be called hopeless little snivelers. So twice a day we would keep a stiff upper lip, for our healer used to clean our wound in the morning, then in the evening. He would use water in which certain kinds of bark had been steeping, and as he cleaned the wounds, he would pronounce healing incantations. The task of teaching and initiating us also fell to him. After the first week, which was passed entirely in the solitude of the hut, and whose monotony had been broken by a few visits from my father, we had recovered enough liberty of movement to be able to go for short walks in the bush, escorted by our healer. As long as we remained in the immediate vicinity of the town, the young men would walk in front. They acted as scouts, so that should some woman be found walking in our direction, they could warn her in time of our approach, and she would go some other way. Indeed, we were not supposed to meet any women at all until our wounds had properly healed. The rule is enforced simply to avoid any delay in the healing of the wound. I do not think any other explanation need be sought. The teaching we received in the bush, far from all the prying eyes, had nothing very mysterious about it. Nothing, I think, that was not fit for ears other than our own. These lessons, the same as had been taught to all those who had gone before us, confined themselves to outlining the sort of conduct befitting a man, to be absolutely straightforward, to cultivate all the virtues that go to make an honest man, to fulfill our duties towards God, towards our parents, our superiors, and our neighbor. And we had to tell nothing of what we learned, either to women or to the uninitiated. Neither had we to reveal any of the secret rites of circumcision. That is the custom. Women, too, are not allowed to tell anything about the rites of excision. Should a non-initiate attempt later on to find out what we had been taught, and try to pass himself off as an initiate in order to do so, we were told how to expose him. The simplest, though not the least laborious way, was by using phrases with refrains that had to be whistled in a certain way. There are very many of these refrains, so many that should the impostor, by some extraordinary chance, have learned 2 or 3, he will find himself baffled by the 4th or the 10th, if not by the 20th. Always lengthy, always complicated. It is impossible to imitate these refrains unless they have been whistled time and time again and patiently learnt by heart. They really require very patient study and an agile memory if one is to retain them all, as we finally realized. Whenever our leader thought we were not learning them fast enough, and indeed we were not always very attentive, he would remind us sharply of our duty. He would avail himself of the pom-pom on our cap, with which he would belabor our backs. That would not hurt very much, you may say. But if the pom-pom is a large one, bound tightly with cotton and with something hard inside, it can be very painful. By the third week, I was allowed to see my mother. When one of the younger men came and said my mother was at the door, I leapt to my feet. "Here, not so fast," he said, taking me by the hand. "Wait for me." "All right, but hurry." 3 weeks. Never before had we been separated from each other for so long. When I used to go on holiday to Tindikan, I would seldom stay away longer than 10 or 15 days, and that was not to be compared with the length of our present separation. "Well, are you coming?" I cried. I was quivering with impatience. "Listen," said the young man. "Listen first of all to what I have to say. You are going to see your mother. You are allowed to see her. But you must stand within the fence when speaking to her. You must not go beyond the fence." "I'll stay inside the fence," I said. "Just let me go." And I tried to shake off my hand. "We'll go together," he said. He had not let go of my hand. We left the hut together. The gate in the fence was open. Several of the young men were sitting on the threshold. They signaled to me not to go beyond it. With a few swift strides, I covered the few yards that separated me from the gate, and suddenly I saw my mother. She was standing in the dusty road a few steps away from the fence. She too was forbidden to come any closer. "Mother!" I cried, "Mother!" And all at once, I felt a lump in my throat. Was it because I could go no closer? Because I could not hug my mother? Was it because we had already been separated so long? Because we were still to be separated a long time? I do not know. All I know is that I could only say mother, and that after my joy in seeing her, I suddenly felt a strange depression. Ought I to attribute this emotional instability to the transformation that had been worked in me? When I had left my mother, I was still a child. Now, but was I really a man now? Was I already a grown man? I was a man. Yes, I was a grown man. And now this manhood had already begun to stand between my mother and myself. It kept us infinitely further apart than the few yards that separated us now. "Mother," I said again, but this time I spoke it very low, like a lament, sadly, as if it were a lament for myself. "Yes, here I am," said my mother. "I've come to see you." "Yes, you've come to see me." And suddenly I passed from sadness to joy. What was I worrying about? My mother was there. She was here in front of me. I only had to go a couple of steps, and I would be at her side. I would certainly have done so if there had not been that absurd order forbidding me to go beyond the gate. "I am glad to see you," went on my mother. She smiled. At once I understood why she was smiling. When she came, she had been a little uneasy, vaguely uneasy. Even though she had had news of my progress, even though my father himself had taken hard news of me, and good news, nevertheless, she had remained a little uneasy. How did she know that she was being told the truth? But now that she had been to see for herself, she had been able to judge for herself from how I looked that my convalescence was well underway, and she was really glad. "I am really very glad," she said. Nevertheless, she did not say anything more. This casual reference was enough. One must not speak openly of anyone's return to health, especially ours. That would not be wise. It would be tempting hostile spirits to attack us. "I brought you some cola nuts," my mother said, as she opened the little basket she held in her hand and showed me the nuts. One of the young men who was sitting by the gate went and took them and gave them to me. "Thank you, Mother. Now I must be getting back," she said. "Say goodbye for me to my father and to everyone." "Yes, I shall do so." "It won't be long now, Mother." "Not very long," she replied. Her voice was trembling a little. I went in at once. Our meeting had not lasted 2 minutes, but that was all we were allowed. And all the time between us, there had been that space that could not be crossed. Poor dear little mother. She had not even held me in her arms. Nevertheless, I am sure she walked away with head held high and with great dignity. She always used to hold herself very straight and so appeared taller than she really was. I seemed to see her walking along the dusty road, her dress falling in noble folds, her waist, hand neatly tied, her hair carefully plaited and drawn back onto the nape of her neck. How long those 3 weeks must have seemed to her. I walked for a while in the yard before going back into the hut. I felt sad. I was feeling sad again. Had I, in losing my childhood, lost my carefree spirits too? I rejoined my companions, shared my nuts with them. Their generally so pleasant bitterness, so refreshing to the palate, was now no more than the purest gall. My father, of course, came often. He could visit me as often as he liked, but we did not have much to say to one another. Those visits, in the midst of my companions and the young men, had no real intimacy about them. During the 4th week, we were allowed more liberty. Our wounds had, for the most part, healed, or else were making such good progress that there was no danger of setbacks to our convalescence. By the end of the week, we had completely recovered. The young men took the framework out of our hats and unpicked our boo-boos. We were now wearing wide trousers, and we were, of course, very anxious to be seen in public. We went for a walk in the town, very proud of ourselves, immensely proud of our new attire, and talking at the top of our voices, as if we were not already drawing enough attention to ourselves. We still remained in a group, and it was again in this single group that we made a round of visits to the various compounds to which we belonged. We were fed everywhere we went, and we did ample justice always to the banquet that awaited us. Now that we were almost well again, several of us were in fact quite well again. I, for my part, had completely recovered. We had wonderful appetites. Whenever an uncircumcised boy came rather too close to our happy band, we would seize him and belabor him playfully with our pompons. But we were still forbidding all contact with girls, and this was a ban which no one thought of breaking. I caught sight of Fanta, and she waved to me at a discreet distance. I answered her likewise by simply fluttering my eyelids. Was I still in love with her? I did not know. We had been so cut off from the world. We had become so different from what we had been, even though a mere month had elapsed between our childhood and our entry into manhood. We had become so indifferent to all that we had been before that I no longer knew quite where I was. Time, I thought, time will help me to settle down again. But how? I had no idea. Finally, the time came when the healer considered us completely recovered and handed us over to our parents again. But I was still at school, and I could no longer join in the excursions which my companions were going on among the neighboring towns and villages. Nor could I take part in their labors in our healer's fields, work which they undertook to repay the care he had taken of us. My parents arranged with him for me to be exempted from it. When I finally got back to my compound, the whole family was waiting for me. My parents held me tightly in their arms, particularly my mother, as if she was wanting secretly to proclaim that I was still her son, that my second birth had done nothing to alter the fact that I was still her son. My father watched us for a moment. Then he said to me, almost regretfully, "From now on, this is your hut, my son." The hut stood opposite my mother's. "Yes," said my mother, "you will sleep there now. But as you can see, I am still within earshot." I opened the door of the hut. My clothes were laid out on the bed. I went up to it and took them in my hands one by one, then put them carefully back. They were men's clothes. Yes, the hut was opposite my mother's. I was still within earshot of her voice, but the clothes on the bed were men's clothes. I was a man. "Are you pleased with your new clothes?" asked my mother. Pleased? Yes, I was pleased. Naturally, I was pleased. At least, I think I was pleased. They were fine clothes. They were. I turned towards my mother. She was smiling sadly at me.